Today's talk is about Muslims living in the West. I'm interested in this talk in the question of gender equality, which is a fundamental value in the West, including Australia today. The question is, should Muslims in the West develop an understanding of Islam that is appropriate to their life in the West, particularly in an area such as gender equality? The answer for me certainly is yes. Muslims are now an essential part of 21st century Western societies, including Australia. The number of Muslims who are born and grow up in the West is rising. In Australia, for instance, such Muslims now constitute over 36% of the Muslim population. Their social and cultural context is vastly different from that of Muslims living in the early centuries of Islam, whether it is in Arabia or elsewhere. Despite this, many Muslims in the West, particularly among the first generation, are still heavily influenced by what classical fiqh or Islamic jurisprudence had to say on the question of gender equality. This classical Islamic jurisprudence or fiqh was developed by Muslims, particularly from the 7th to the 10th centuries of the Common Era, or from the 1st to the 4th centuries of the Islamic calendar, at a time and context that is hugely different to life in the West today. In spite of the hundreds of progressive verses and ideas in the Holy Qur'an in relation to women that justify the notion of gender equality, even in the 7th century Arabia, most Muslim jurists of the early centuries of Islam did not see women necessarily as equal to men. Many jurists believed, in line with prevailing views in their own social and cultural contexts, that women, for example, had to be protected by men, were not capable of taking prominent leadership roles in society, and that their evidence in court in certain matters was not equal to that of men. They also believed that women should take more responsibility for the moral well-being of the society, and that their beauty, for example, distracts men and therefore they should be covered. Some even believed that for sexual offenses, women should be punished more harshly than men for otherwise similar offenses. Of course, such beliefs about women at the time influenced how early Muslim jurists interpreted the teachings of the Holy Qur'an and of the Prophet Muhammad in relation to women. Unfortunately, these ideas of the classical period still influences the thinking of more conservative Muslims even in the West. For the conservative elements, the notion of gender equality as it exists in the West cannot be reconciled with their understanding of Islam. If this is the case, is there any hope of Muslims in the West coming to terms with the issue of gender equality? Can Muslims move away from the interpretations developed by early Muslims of the Holy Qur'an and the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad? Despite the generally pessimistic assessment of many Western commentators on Islam on this issue, and the unhelpful overgeneralizations made about Islam, there are many reasons why one should indeed be very optimistic. First, not all Muslims, or dare I say, not even a significant minority of Muslims, would be prepared to accept these classical ideas about women that are supported by the more conservative Muslims. Many second and third generation Muslims in the West, both women and men, are arguing for a rethinking of these classical ideas. For these Muslims, there is much in the Holy Qur'an and the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad to support the kind of conception of gender equality as it exists in the West. They do not see the interpretations of early Muslims as necessarily binding on Muslims today. It is the actual text of the Quran that mainstream Muslims consider to be sacrosanct, not the opinion or interpretations of classical Muslims or pre-modern Muslims or Muslims of the classical period. There is no reason whatsoever why new interpretations should not emerge and supersede earlier interpretations.